On the morning of December 17, 1944, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper sat in the turret of his command vehicle, watching American prisoners line up in a snow-covered field near a Belgian crossroads. His Kampfgruppe had already traveled further into Allied lines than any German unit in months. Speed was everything. His tanks needed to reach the Meuse River bridges before the Americans could react. At 29 years old, Peiper embodied the Waffen-SS ethos that had earned his unit the nickname Blowtorch Battalion on the Eastern Front. He had served as Himmler's personal adjutant. He knew exactly what Berlin expected from this offensive. As his column prepared to continue west toward Ligneville, leaving a small detachment to guard over 120 American prisoners, Peiper believed he was executing the kind of ruthless warfare that would split the Allied armies and change the course of the war. He was wrong. Within hours, 84 of those prisoners would be dead in that field, machine-gunned and shot in the head at close range. The massacre at Baugnes Crossroads, which became known as the Malmedy massacre, would not terrify the Americans into submission. Instead, it would harden every Allied soldier's resolve to accept no surrender from SS units, fuel a massive counter-offensive that would crush Germany's last reserves, and create a legal reckoning that would pursue Peiper and his men for the rest of their lives. This is the story of how Hitler's order for terror and fright backfired catastrophically, how one atrocity stiffened an entire army's spine, and how the perpetrator's own words would condemn them. The massacre didn't happen in isolation. It was the direct result of Hitler's strategic philosophy for the Ardennes counteroffensive: break through with such shocking brutality that the enemy loses the will to fight. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West. Two massive panzer armies and the 7th Army punched through American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The objective was ambitious: cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split British forces from American ones. Hitler believed this would force the Western Allies to negotiate peace, allowing him to concentrate all German forces against the Soviet advance in the East. But the plan required more than military success. It demanded psychological warfare. SS General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, received explicit instructions from Hitler himself. The Führer's directive was clear. Soldiers were to be preceded by a wave of terror and fright. No human inhibitions were to be shown. Every resistance was to be broken by terror. Prisoners of war were to be shot. This wasn't a rogue officer's interpretation. This was doctrine flowing from the highest level of Nazi command. Dietrich passed these orders down to his division commanders, including Joachim Peiper, who led Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. This wasn't just any division. It had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard and had grown into an elite Waffen-SS formation with a documented history of atrocities on the Eastern Front, where it earned its Blowtorch Battalion nickname for burning Russian villages with their inhabitants inside. Now these same troops were tasked with achieving the impossible, reaching the Meuse River within 24 hours of the offensive beginning, traveling through terrible terrain on inadequate roads in the worst winter weather Belgium had seen in years. By the morning of December 17th, Peiper's column was already behind schedule. A destroyed bridge at Losheim had forced a detour. An unexpected defense by just 22 American soldiers at Lanzerath had delayed his entire Kampfgruppe for almost a full day. These weren't supposed to happen. Intelligence had indicated the Ardennes sector was lightly defended by inexperienced or exhausted American units resting after heavy combat. But even undermanned American forces were fighting harder than expected. Peiper grew increasingly frustrated. Time was slipping away. At Honsfeld, early on the 17th, his troops captured the town and executed dozens of American prisoners in their first documented massacre. They needed the fuel depot there, and Peiper deviated from his assigned route to capture it. At Bullingen, after forcing American prisoners to refuel his tanks, approximately 50 POWs were shot. This was the pattern emerging: capture, exploitation, execution. The orders from Hitler through Dietrich were being implemented exactly as designed. Around noon on December 17th, Piper's vanguard approached the crossroads at Baugny, about 2.5 miles southeast of the town of Malmedy. The roads here connected several directions, north to Malmedy, south to Ligneville, east back toward Germany, west toward the interior of Belgium. It was exactly the kind of intersection that retreating American units would use, and at that precise moment, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was driving through. Battery B consisted of approximately 140 men, traveling in a convoy of about 30 unarmored trucks and jeeps. These weren't infantry. They weren't trained or equipped for frontline combat. Their job was to identify enemy artillery positions through sound ranging and flash spotting. They carried only small arms. They had left Malmedy just minutes earlier, heading south to join the 7th Armored Division at St. Vith. They had no idea that the German offensive had already pushed this far west, or that one of the most dangerous SS formations in the entire German military was bearing down on them. The lead elements of Kampfgruppe Piper spotted the American column first. SS Obersturmführer Werner Sternebeck commanded the forward tanks. He saw the American trucks negotiating the intersection moving south, completely exposed. His lead panzer opened fire immediately. Several vehicles caught fire. The column became confused, vehicles running off the road, crashing into each other. American soldiers began dismounting, some attempting to return fire with their rifles and carbines against armored vehicles and machine guns. It was hopeless. The firepower disparity was overwhelming. Within minutes, the brief firefight ended. Some Americans managed to flee into the woods before the German cordon closed, but approximately 113 men were captured. They surrendered, hands raised, clearly disarmed. Under international law, they were now prisoners of war entitled to protection under the Geneva Conventions. They should have been searched, documented, and moved to a rear area POW facility for the duration of the conflict. Piper's unit had the obligation to guard them, yes, but also to protect them. Instead, Piper's forces corralled the prisoners and led them into an open field adjacent to the crossroads. This was nothing more than a cow pasture, flat and exposed. The Germans positioned the American POWs in neat rows. Some accounts say 8 rows. The men stood in the cold, breath visible in the December air, feet in the snow that covered the ground. Armed SS soldiers surrounded them. 2 German half-tracks equipped with machine guns moved into position, their weapons trained on the assembled prisoners. What happened next remains one of the most documented atrocities of the Western Front in World War II. According to survivors, after about half an hour of standing in the field, a tracked vehicle pulled up on the road about 25 yards away. A German officer or non-commissioned officer stood on top. As if engaging in target practice, he fired into the group of standing men, taking deliberate aim. Sergeant Kenneth Ardennes watched a man from his battery, standing about 10 feet in front of him in the front row, drop to the ground, shot through the head. Before Ardennes could process what was happening, he saw another man drop, again shot through the head. Then the machine guns opened up. The Waffen-SS fired their machine guns directly into the packed group of unarmed prisoners. The sustained gunfire lasted approximately 30 minutes, with sporadic bursts continuing after that. Men fell where they stood, others panicked and tried to flee. The SS soldiers shot them as they ran. Some Americans dropped to the ground immediately, pretending to be dead, hoping to survive by lying still among the corpses of their comrades. The machine gun fire raked back and forth across the field, ensuring maximum casualties. But the killing didn't end with the machine guns falling silent. SS soldiers dismounted their vehicles and walked through the field of bodies. They were conducting what the French call coup de grâce, mercy killings of the wounded, except there was no mercy here. These were execution squads finishing the job. They kicked bodies to see who was still alive. If a man flinched, moved, or showed any sign of breathing, the SS trooper shot him in the head at close range with a pistol. Sometimes they used rifle butts instead, bludgeoning men to death. Survivors lying motionless in the snow heard the SS soldiers laughing as they walked among the dead and dying. Mario Butera, one of the survivors, lay conscious but motionless. He heard German voices and laughter. He heard pistol shots. The man lying beside him was moaning and spitting blood. A German approached and fired 4 shots from a pistol into that man's body. Butera held his breath, forcing himself not to react, not to move, barely allowing himself to breathe. The German walked past him. Around him, the methodical executions continued, the smell of blood mixed with gunpowder. The cold seeped through his uniform as he lay in the snow, waiting, hoping the Germans would leave. Some Americans who fled the initial gunfire managed to reach a cafe at the Ardennes crossroads. They sought shelter inside, perhaps thinking they could hide until the German column moved on. The SS soldiers discovered them. Rather than accept their surrender, the Germans set the building on fire. Then they positioned themselves at the exits and shot every American soldier who tried to escape the flames. No one inside survived. After the shooting finally stopped, after the SS soldiers returned to their vehicles and the Kampfgruppe continued its advance toward Ligneville, 84 American prisoners of war lay dead in that field. Another 43 men survived, either by successfully playing dead and remaining motionless until the Germans left, or by fleeing before the systematic executions reached them. These survivors would stagger through the snowy woods, some wounded, all traumatized, making their way back to American lines to report what had happened. The first survivors encountered a patrol from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion around 2:30 in the afternoon on December 17th, just hours after the massacre. Their testimony was immediate, detailed, and credible. By evening, rumors that the SS were executing American prisoners had spread throughout the U.S. Army and Europe. The Inspector General of the First Army learned of the massacre approximately 4 hours after it occurred. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, but not in the way Hitler had intended. Instead of breaking American morale, the Malmedy massacre had the opposite effect. American soldiers fighting in the Ardennes now understood there was no falling back, no surrender. If they encountered SS units and tried to surrender, they would likely be murdered. The only option was to fight harder, resist more fiercely, and take no SS prisoners themselves. Unofficial orders spread rapidly. Don't accept surrender from Waffen-SS troops. Shoot them. The massacre that was meant to terrorize the Americans into collapse instead crystallized their determination to win. And this wasn't the only atrocity Kampfgruppe Peiper committed during their advance. This was a pattern. At multiple Belgian towns, SS troops summarily executed civilians on suspicion of resistance activity or simply as a deterrent to discourage others from interfering with German military operations. At Stavelot, as many as 164 Belgian men, women, and children were massacred. In approximately half a dozen towns, males over 16 were shot on sight. These weren't combat casualties. These were war crimes, deliberate violations of the laws and customs of war, committed systematically as Peiper's formation drove deeper into Belgium. But Kampfgruppe Peiper never reached the Meuse River. The American resistance, stiffened partly by news of the massacres, held key road junctions. Fuel shortages plagued the German advance. The terrain and roads were worse than anticipated. By late December, Peiper's formation was surrounded at La Glaise, running out of ammunition and fuel. Peiper abandoned his heavy equipment and fought his way back to German lines on foot with what remained of his force. The entire Ardennes offensive, Germany's last major attack in the West, collapsed by January 1945. The bulge the Germans created in Allied lines was pushed back. American forces resumed their advance toward Germany. On January 13, 1945, American troops recaptured the crossroads at Ardennes. The next day, January 14th, they found the field. Under the snow, preserved by the winter cold, lay the bodies of the 84 American soldiers murdered by Kampfgruppe Peiper. Lieutenant Colonel Welch of the Army Inspector General Office oversaw the initial investigation. Combat photographers documented everything. Graves registration units carefully recovered each body, marking positions, photographing wounds, preparing the remains for autopsy. The forensic evidence told the story in medical detail. 20 of the 84 corpses showed gunshot wounds to the head with gunpowder burn residue, indicating the weapon had been fired at extremely close range, a coup de grace execution shot. 20 other bodies had small-caliber gunshot wounds to the head without powder residue, meaning they were shot from slightly further away but still deliberately targeted in the head. 10 corpses showed blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being beaten to death with rifle butts. The remaining bodies had various wounds from the machine gun fire, but many showed single, deliberate headshots, either to the temple or behind the ear. These weren't wounds sustained during combat. These were executions. Most tellingly, the bodies were found in a very small area of the field, clustered together. This proved the Germans had grouped the Americans and fired on them systematically, not scattered over a wide area as would happen in a confused firefight. The physical evidence corroborated the survivors' testimony completely. This was a premeditated massacre of unarmed prisoners of war. The American military immediately publicized the atrocity. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered a full investigation. Stars and Stripes, Yank Magazine, and Life Magazine all ran stories about the massacre. The American public was outraged. But more importantly, the U.S. Army began tracking down every member of Kampfgruppe Peiper they could find. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, American military authorities launched a massive manhunt for the perpetrators. They established that Kampfgruppe Peiper had killed between 538 and 749 American POWs during the Battle of the Bulge, along with 111 Belgian civilians. The Malmedy massacre was the largest single incident, but it was part of a systematic campaign of murder. Investigators eventually identified and captured approximately 400 members of the unit. The suspects were taken to Schwabisch Hall near Stuttgart for interrogation. Many of the American interrogators were German-speaking soldiers who had fled Nazi persecution in Europe and become U.S. citizens. Some, like Lieutenant William Pearl, had personal reasons to seek justice. Pearl's wife had survived Ravensbrück concentration camp. The interrogations were intense, detailed, and productive. Many SS prisoners, when separated and questioned individually, provided confessions or testimony implicating their officers and fellow soldiers. By May 1946, American authorities had selected 74 men to face trial. The charges included Josef Sepp Dietrich, the SS general commanding the entire 6th Panzer Army; Hermann Priess, Corps commander; Werner Poetschke, the battalion commander who directly oversaw the prisoners at Baugnes. Poetschke had died in March 1945, but others under his command were charged; and Joachim Peiper himself, the Kampfgruppe commander whose name would become synonymous with the massacre. The trial convened at the former Dachau concentration camp, a grimly appropriate location. The Dachau trials were the U.S. Army's venue for prosecuting war crimes in the American occupation zone of Germany. The Malmedy massacre trial, formerly U.S. versus Valentin Bersin et al., ran from May 16 to July 16, 1946. The defendants sat in the courtroom with numbered identification cards around their necks. 7 American survivors testified in person, walking the tribunal through the events of December 17 in excruciating detail. Belgian civilians who witnessed atrocities in Stavelot and other towns also gave testimony. The prosecution introduced nearly 100 sworn statements, including confessions from many of the defendants themselves. The evidence was overwhelming. Friedrich Kreist, who commanded the 2nd Panzer Company of the 1st Panzer Regiment, testified under oath that his instructions before the offensive were clear. We as Panzertruppe, while breaking through with speed, were not to take up time by bringing in prisoners of war. When asked why, he explained that otherwise the speed of the advance would be reduced, and by detailing crews to guard prisoners, our fighting strength would be reduced considerably. This was a direct admission that the policy was to avoid taking prisoners, which in practice meant shooting them. Dietrich admitted that Hitler had given orders that no quarter was to be granted, no prisoners taken, and no pity shown toward Belgian civilians. Multiple defendants confirmed they understood this meant prisoners would be shot. The prosecution successfully argued this was a premeditated conspiracy to wage ruthless warfare in violation of international law. The defense, led by Colonel Willis M. Everett, Jr., faced an impossible task. The facts weren't in dispute. American POWs had been murdered. The defense strategy was to argue the killings happened in the heat of battle, that some prisoners had attempted to escape or recovered their weapons and fired on German troops, forcing a response. Some defendants claimed they weren't present at Baugnes. Others claimed they were following orders and had no choice. Under military law, following orders is not an absolute defense against war crimes charges, but it can be a mitigating factor. The trial lasted 2 months. On July 16, 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict. All 73 defendants were found guilty. The sentences were severe. 43 men, including Joachim Peiper, were sentenced to death by hanging. 23 received life imprisonment. The remainder received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. But the aftermath of the trial became almost as controversial as the massacre itself. The defense team, particularly Colonel Everett, alleged that American interrogators at Schwabish Hall had used torture and coercion to extract confessions. The defendants claimed they had been beaten, subjected to mock trials, kept in solitary confinement near starvation rations, and had their families threatened. Some claimed matches were driven under their fingernails. Others claimed their testicles were permanently damaged. These allegations created a political firestorm. German veterans groups, religious organizations, and some American defense attorneys argued the convictions were tainted by improper interrogation methods. In December 1948, the Secretary of the Army ordered an investigation. A commission chaired by Justice Gordon Simpson of the Texas Supreme Court examined the claims. One commission member, Judge Edward Van Roden of Pennsylvania, allegedly made public statements claiming the allegations were true, though he later testified under oath that he had been misquoted and the most extreme claims were false. The controversy grew. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, with his state's large German-American population, took a particular interest in the case. McCarthy obtained permission to attend Senate subcommittee hearings on the Malmedy trial in 1949. He aggressively questioned American interrogators, particularly Lieutenant Pearl, even demanding Pearl take a polygraph test. McCarthy's behavior during the hearings was combative and accusatory. He sympathized openly with the convicted SS men and implied the Jewish interrogators were motivated by revenge rather than justice. The Senate investigation, led by Senator Raymond Baldwin of Connecticut, ultimately rejected the most serious allegations of torture. The subcommittee found that while some procedural irregularities occurred, there was no systematic torture, no evidence supporting claims of 137 men having their testicles damaged, and no basis to overturn the convictions. Judge Van Roden himself testified that he never said all but 2 defendants were kicked in the testicles beyond repair, and that this statement in an article attributed to him was absolutely wrong and an exaggeration. But the political damage was done. In the context of the emerging Cold War, with West Germany becoming a crucial ally against the Soviet Union, there was enormous pressure to show leniency toward German war criminals. By 1951, most of the Malmedy defendants had been released. The death sentences, including Peiper's, were commuted. Sepp Dietrich was released in 1955. Joachim Peiper walked free in December 1956, having served just 10 years. Peiper found work with Porsche as a clerk. He maintained contact with other SS veterans, sometimes helping them conceal their wartime service to secure employment. But in the late 1950s, pressure from Porsche workers who knew his history forced him out. Peiper remained an unrepentant Nazi. He moved to France, settling in the small town of Traves in eastern France, where he worked as a translator under a pseudonym. He lived quietly with his wife until 1974, when a former French resistance member recognized him. French communist groups began targeting Peiper. He received death threats. Graffiti appeared on roads near his house. In an interview, Peiper complained he was a victim of communist harassment and insisted he had paid for his crimes. On the evening of July 13, 1976, Bastille Day in France, arsonists set fire to Peiper's house. When firefighters finally controlled the blaze, they found his charred, shrunken body inside, clutching a rifle and a handgun. Evidence suggested he had tried to fight off his attackers and had attempted to throw some possessions out of a window before the smoke overcame him. No one was ever arrested for the killing, but a group calling itself the Avengers claimed responsibility. Joachim Peiper died at age 61, killed exactly the way his victims might have wished, violently, desperately, and without mercy. But the testimony of the massacre's impact comes most powerfully not from the perpetrators' fates, but from the American response during the battle itself. The massacre didn't break American will, it hardened it. When soldiers of the 11th Armored Division captured 80 German Wehrmacht soldiers at Chenogne, Belgium on New Year's Day 1945, they lined them up and machine-gunned them in retaliation for Malmedy. These German prisoners weren't even Waffen-SS. They were regular army soldiers who had nothing to do with the Baugnes massacre, but American troops, enraged by what had happened to their comrades, committed their own war crime in response. General George S. Patton's diary entry about Chenogne was revealing, "I hope we can conceal this." And they did. No American soldier was ever prosecuted for the Chenogne massacre. When Eisenhower ordered an investigation, the 11th Armored Division dragged its feet until after VE Day, then told Eisenhower, "It's too late, the war is over, the units are disbanded." The killing of SS prisoners by American forces became unofficial policy. An order from the U.S. 328th Infantry on December 21, 1944, explicitly stated, "No SS troops or paratroopers will be taken prisoner, but will be shot on sight." This was the real impact of the Malmedy massacre. Hitler's strategy of terror warfare backfired completely. Instead of breaking Allied morale, it eliminated any restraint American forces might have shown toward German units, particularly the SS. It turned the final months of the war in Europe into a fight to the death. German soldiers who might have surrendered and survived now fought to the last because they knew, especially if they wore SS insignia, the Americans would show them the same mercy Kampfgruppe Peiper had shown at Baugnes. None. The most damning testimony about the massacre's effect comes from the German perspective. After the war, German generals analyzed why the Ardennes offensive failed. Logistics, fuel shortages, weather, American reinforcements all played roles. But they also noted that American resistance was far fiercer than expected. Units that intelligence suggested would collapse instead fought tenaciously for every road junction, every town, every bridge. The delay this caused was fatal to German timetables, and soldiers on both sides understood why. Malmedy had changed the rules. There was no safe surrender anymore. You fought until you won, or you died trying. The memorial at the Baugnes Crossroads today honors the 87 U.S. servicemen killed by Kampfgruppe Peiper on December 17, 1944. The figure includes 3 additional men who died shortly after from wounds sustained in the massacre. Visitors can stand in the field where the prisoners were lined up and machine-gunned. The pastoral landscape, the quiet crossroads, the peaceful Belgian countryside, none of it suggests the horror that unfolded there 80 years ago. But the memorial stone stands as a permanent reminder that war crimes carry consequences that echo through generations. The Malmedy massacre wasn't just a single atrocity, it was a case study in how terror tactics can backfire, how war crimes investigations can be both necessary and complicated, and how justice delayed can become justice denied. The legal battles over the trial procedures, the allegations of torture, the political manipulation by McCarthy, and the eventual release of nearly all convicted perpetrators show how difficult it is to achieve meaningful accountability for wartime atrocities, especially when geopolitical considerations intervene. But the massacre also demonstrated something else: the resilience of soldiers who refused to be terrorized. Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens, who survived the machine gun fire and played dead in the snow, returned to combat. The other survivors, traumatized and wounded, made their way back to American lines, and then, incredibly, many returned to the fight. The 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion reconstituted and continued serving. These men didn't break. The terror and fright Hitler ordered Dietrich to inflict didn't shatter American resolve, it forged it harder. In the end, Joachim Peiper's confidence on the morning of December 17, 1944, as he watched American prisoners being corralled in that field, proved catastrophically misplaced. He believed he was executing a strategy of ruthless efficiency that would help Germany win the war. Instead, he set in motion a chain of events that would contribute to Germany's defeat define his own legacy as a war criminal, and ensure that 84 American soldiers murdered in the snow at a Belgian crossroads would never be forgotten. The massacre that was meant to break the Americans instead became their rallying cry, and the perpetrators' own words and actions at trial provided all the evidence needed to prove their guilt. That is the bitter irony of Malmedy. The terror was real, but it terrorized the wrong army.